The survival archetypes are there to help you survive, but not thrive, right? So a lot of times when we're playing out the survival archetypes, we're doing what we think we have to do to stay alive, either literally or metaphorically. But a lot of times that's usually at the expense of our own health, at the expense of our own freedom, at the expense of our own empowerment.
Welcome to Living 4D with Paul Chek. Today, Paul welcomes back Greg Schmaus. Greg is a holistic health practitioner and founder of Healing 4D. He is the creator of Healing the Mind, a journey to wholeness, and Healing Your Core Archetypes, a journey of empowerment. Through Greg's coaching and programs, he guides clients and students from all over the world in finding meaning and purpose to their healing journeys. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and a warm review on the podcast platform of your choice. Your opinions matter, and your ratings help us to grow and help more people to be healthy, find freedom of body and mind, and to live their dreams. A big thank you to our premier sponsors, Bioptimizers, Organifi, and Paleo Valley, our podcast sponsors, Ned and Wild Pastures, and our preferred product sponsor, Peak Life. Their support is essential in producing this podcast, and we hope you will show your support by visiting them online and trying all the amazing products they produce. Please check the show notes for links and details. Today, Paul and Greg are talking on the topic of archetypes and healing.
This is my third podcast with Greg Schmaus. If you haven't listened to the 2 previous podcasts with Greg, they're fantastic. And we're going to journey into some of the most important concepts for our own personal healing with Greg today. And we'll get into all the nitty-gritty and explanation of keywords like what is an archetype, and discuss some of the important contents that Greg has in his course, which I think is something worth exploring because we all have archetypal healing to do, which is a necessary part of our psychological growth and development and our spiritual growth and development. And Greg has done a lot of that healing himself. Through all that healing, he's really developed a level of mastery of it. And we spent a lot of time working on these issues when he was my client for 2.5 years. And we made a lot of progress together. And I'm super excited that he's out there making amazing courses and helping a lot of people. So Greg, welcome back.
Thank you, Paul. It's an honor to be here.
Well, you ready to dive into this amazing course you got and see if we can share lots of things with people, whether they take the course or not, and inspire them to, as Ken Wilber says, wake up, clean up, grow up, and show up?
I sure hope so. And this course is very much an expression of my own healing journey, as the first course was. But this course actually, came from a deeper place inside of me. It was really an expression of wanting to understand myself, wanting to understand the reasons I do the things I do, the reasons I say the things I say, and also really understand the unique blockages that show up on the healing journey for each one of us, and to kind of answer that $1,000,000 question of why sometimes people don't heal.
Well, that's a big one. And the other thing is why we don't do the things we should do and why we don't say the things we need to say too. That's equally important, isn't it?
Yeah. When it comes to the healing process, which we'll get into this in quite depth, there's a lot of different aspects of us that have some benefit in not healing. And what I really wanted to get to the root of was to really understand why, to really understand what these key obstacles were. And the first place that I started is my own life. So a lot of this course is not just me studying these archetypes in a textbook somewhere, but using the curriculum of my own life journey as the best classroom to really understand these patterns. And also the beauty of it is we all have these archetypes, so we can all relate to it. It's not something that's unique to any one of us as individuals.
No, I think the discussion will make that really obvious to people. It's, that's the nature of an archetype, as we will discuss. But I think, the world is mirroring back to us right now our personal and collective need to really look into these archetypes,
Yeah.
both for our personal healing and to see why we have some of these collective nightmares going on that just keep repeating themselves over and over again, which is exactly what happens when you're caught in your unconscious programming, or when you have traumas that are not resolved. You just keep attracting the same situations back to you, because ultimately, spirit and soul are here to grow and become. And so if we have these limitations in us, then we can't really move past them. Just like, if you're building a multi-story building and you use cheap cement and rotten wood, the building's going to keep collapsing where you keep using cheap cement and rotten wood. And no matter how many times you make that mistake, gravity will always bring justice to you. And so the ego, as you know, creates inertia. It's got psychic mass, and the programming that we carry has its function, and we'll probably talk about some of these things. I'm sure we will. But the problem is that some of our coping strategies that help get us by ultimately can become like a drag suit for a swimmer. You can never really get free of the drag of these things or the weight of them. And sometimes people get so accustomed to having these impediments to their own full expression of themselves that they become so identified with themselves that they actually fall into this dangerous place of not knowing who they would be without them. And that's, going to be in your survival archetypes that we'll talk about. But, these are things that are rarely talked about. And even in most standard psychological circles, you could spend 10 years with a psychologist and have no one look into these archetypes, especially if you're dealing with behavioral psychologists, which is really a common approach, because behavioral psychology tries to deal with things at the level of the ego, which I've always find quite fascinating how they actually think that's going to work. And having studied many books on this, one of the common things they say is, oh, you don't have to worry about your childhood programming. That's not necessary. It's just a matter of behavior change. And so, the problem is I've been doing this for, as 40 years as of January, and I've never seen that approach work other than like a superficial type modulation of one situation. So someone might have an addiction. They use behavioral modification, but the next thing you know, they've just got another type of addiction that might be more socially acceptable. So it looks like they've changed, but they really have just traded one problem for a new one. That's all.
When you're coaching people, which I've, been working as a holistic health practitioner and Chek practitioner for almost 10 years now, you give people things to do which involves behavior change, whether it's dietary changes, exercise to do, meditation. And you notice that a lot of people end up not doing them, even though that that change will be beneficial for them.
And they do too. That's the paradox. They'll come back and go, I don't know why I'm not doing that, and that's one of the ways you're caught in your programming, when people say things and do things and say things like, I don't know why I said that. I knew I shouldn't have said that, but I did it and I don't know why. That's a clear indicator that you have an unconscious program running. And, in all fairness to people, one of the challenges is they don't have enough management of what you and I refer to as the four doctors to have enough energy to go through the change process. Change takes a lot of energy, and it takes real commitment and focus. So if someone's tired and not healthy, their body's in survival mode. So, changing your relationship with alcohol, or better managing an abusive relationship, or healing childhood wounds is something that the psyche doesn't think is essential when the body itself is not healthy. So, I would preface our conversation by saying that this is all very important, but it's also built on the fact that you have to have some level of commitment to, having a clearly stated dream, moving your body adequately, eating healthy food in proportions that are ideal for your needs, and getting enough rest. And of course, this is all part of Dr. Quiet's introspection, looking into yourself. So getting enough sleep is one thing, but taking time each day to honestly evaluate how your day unfolded, how do you feel about your relationship with yourself through the day, and how do you feel about your relationship with others through the day. And if we don't take that time for self-reflection, then we're completely unaware that we're actually living a Groundhog Day experience where we end up having the same conflicts with friends, family, coworkers, bosses, parents, and ourselves. And so, these are very, very important things. And that's why, as you know, I have the four doctrine model as sort of the forefront of my education, because I'm very, very aware that you have to have the energy to change, and you have to have a dream big enough that it's more important for you to achieve than living in crisis mode all the time. So with that kind of preface, your course is titled Healing Your Core Archetypes, A Journey of Empowerment. Other than your own healing, what inspired you to create this course?
Yeah, obviously my own healing, my own desire to understand my patterning, but also, like I was saying, having worked with clients for almost 10 years now, really wanting to deeply understand, why is the change process so hard for people? Why do people have a tendency to continue to make choices that are not serving them or optimal for them when a part of them knows it, but it seems like there's some sort of secondary gain in not healing? So that big question of why people don't heal and what are the most common blockages and obstacles in the healing process, and what part of us is actually benefiting from our illness, what part of us might be benefiting from some sort of pain or disease, is something that I've always been so curious about, both professionally, but also exploring my own patterns of self-sabotage in the past. So a lot of it is really, my willingness and my desire to understand these patterns, and also starting to really see how one's relationship with these archetypes are really our relationship with our own power, our relationship with how we get our needs met. And they also represent a lot of the deeper contracts that we have in relationship to ourselves, others, life, etc. And so it was really a deep desire to understand all of this and then be able to share it with others.
Yes. What are some of the types of changes people experience in themselves and in their lives after completing your course or addressing their core archetypal issues with you, either in private coaching or people that have completed the course and you've had a chance to talk to them?
Yeah, I would say the first thing is always greater self-awareness, which I think is absolutely critical. And the self-awareness with these archetypes, when you're working with archetypes and you're creating a relationship with them, you're creating this subject-object relationship with a pattern, which creates space for you to make a different choice. There's a difference between unconsciously identifying with something versus consciously being in relationship with something. And when you can start to be in relationship with an archetype, you create enough space between you and the archetype to actually reevaluate, reassess, and have the space inside of you to make a different choice. The other thing is, having this awareness allows people to see their patterns of self-sabotage, allows them to see where they're getting their needs met in some unhealthy way, whether it's holding on to an illness as a way of receiving more empathy and compassion from people, or not wanting to heal their back pain when they say they do, but they realize they're on medical leave from a job that they don't enjoy. So you start to see a lot of obvious patterns as to where the blockages are in the healing process. And I think this course and a lot of my work with individuals studying these archetypes allows them to see and allows them to clear the path so healing can actually happen. A lot of times we're the biggest obstacle between us and our own healing. And
Most of the time.
most of the time, and the ways in which we used to get our needs met, which brought us a sense of safety and security as a child, but now might be holding us back from a sense of freedom and empowerment. So a lot of this course and a lot of the coaching in these archetypes is really letting go of the old contract that brought you a sense of safety and security, and really negotiating with yourself a new contract that's moving you more towards a sense of freedom and empowerment. So those, I think, are the key ingredients of what people experience with this course.
Yeah, those are important. Now, you're using some words that people might find hard to comprehend. One is a relationship with a pattern, and then having contracts. I'm interested to hear, how are you having a relationship with a pattern, and what's your conception of these contracts that you're suggesting we've made?
When I say patterns, I mean how these archetypes express themselves. We can take the victim archetype. There's a way in which we act out the pattern of the victim archetype. And once we can see it not necessarily as us, but as an expression of the victim archetype, now you're in relationship with it. And I have free will separate from Paul because I experience myself separate from Paul. So there's a subject-object relationship. So with this work, you allow yourself to create enough space between you and that archetypal pattern that allows you to engage it, understand it, develop a relationship with, and then gives you the free will to make a different choice. So that's what I meant by being in relationship with a pattern, is creating that space between you and how that archetype expresses, so your awareness can then lead you into a different choice, another option.
Yes, to that I would add that we haven't given the description of an archetype yet, but the things that I would add in that regard would be, archetype, as we're about to get into, means primal pattern or original pattern. So when we're talking about archetypes, we're talking about something that isn't like a pattern drawn on a blackboard or in art or on a t-shirt. We're talking about a mode of conscious expression. An archetype is a mode through which the psyche creates meaning, conscious awareness. And we'll go deeper into this in a minute with your explanation of what an archetype is. But why I'm bringing this up is to help people understand that when you're talking about an archetype, you're actually talking about an aspect of one's psyche. Now, an archetype, a set of archetypes that most everybody's familiar with, are the signs of the zodiac, such as, I'm born on the cutoff between Leo and Virgo. Somebody might be a Gemini or a Cancer or a Scorpio. Those are archetypes. And an archetype transforms pure psychic energy into some aspect with which we can make meaning. So if you think of God as pure consciousness, there's no way to know something that is unconditional like that. Pure, we wouldn't even know pure energy if we were walking through it, but we know sunlight because it's transformed from pure potential energy into sunlight and warmth. So you could say that the sun can be an archetype, the archetype of growth, or the archetype of warmth, or the archetype of self, as is often, because we have a solar plexus, which is where our sense of self is at. So here, if we see that the sun is drawing energy from its environment, which is invisible energy, and it's producing visible energy we call light and heat, then the sun would be like an archetype that allows us to make meaning out of something that we could not comprehend because we don't have any means of comprehending something that doesn't have any way to express it. An empty page doesn't tell you very much. But if I hand you a page with 26 letters of the alphabet on it, you can say, okay, he's handing me a page with the alphabet on it. And then if you said to me, what are those letters on the page? I would say, well, there are archetypes, and each of them has a mode of creating meaning. For example, if we use the letter I, then we all know that we're talking about ourselves. But if we say we're using the letters I space A M, then we're talking about some verb of ourself. I am talking to Greg, or I am meditating. So the pure energy that I was referring to before would be like the empty page, which in this, for those that have the orientation toward God, God would be unconditional love. It would be that which everything, but nothing that you can comprehend because it's unconditional. So an archetype is a converter. It's like the technical word is manifold. It takes one thing and converts it into something else. And without that, we can't make meaning. So just like the letters of an alphabet allow us to communicate in ways that make meaning, archetypes do the same thing in our psyche. Without archetypes, we would have no way to think. We would have no way to process information, nor would we have any way to understand our emotions, and therefore we would remain completely and utterly unconscious. We would be like a hose that doesn't know that water is flowing through it, just like we don't know that God's flowing through us all the time without archetypes. I wanted to clarify that because a lot of people might be confused as to how do you have a relationship with a pattern, but these are actually patterns of psychic energy that are common to all human beings. And Jung was really the one that first objectified that in ways that we could understand it. There was many people that talked about these things, but he calls the realm of archetypes the objective psyche. What Greg's experiencing as he sits in his chair right now, and what Paul's experiencing as he's sitting in his chair is subjective. But the fact that we're both sitting on chairs is objective because there's an archetype for chairs, which includes all chairs or anything that you sit on and use as a chair. So there we have something objective between us. So for those of you listening, an archetype or all archetypes compose what Jung referred to as the objective psyche, because they're all things that we can relate to in common, but we need them to understand and communicate with each other. Why don't you go ahead and share whatever else you wanted to share with regard to what an archetype is, just so we make sure that people have a clear understanding as we go in, because if you don't understand what an archetype is, this conversation could be quite confusing.
Yeah, so like you had shared a little bit earlier, an archetype is an original pattern, and it really represents the language of the psyche. And the archetypes are really very much the vehicles that we use to express ourselves in relationship to self and other. So, you could say that there's, in our relationship, there was the student and teacher archetype relationship. There's the coach and mentor, right? So we're all taking on roles of certain archetypes as a way of expressing ourselves and as a way of relating, which allows us to come to know ourselves. So archetypes really allow us to have a language to come to know ourselves in individual form.
To thine own self be true, or thou canst be true to any other man. And until you know yourself, you're really never going to be able to distinguish yourself from other. The beautiful thing about the course you put together is it really orients itself toward the archetypes that are most essential for us to look into, because most of the challenges that come up with the survival archetypes and what we call the core archetypes actually have to do with our programming by our parents, family, education, society, culture, media. And so we often find ourselves acting out our persona, which is a combination of all this programming, but we sometimes can, and sadly more often than we would like to admit, get into a situation where we have feelings of not liking ourselves, but not knowing how to change ourselves. For example, why am I so lazy? Or why can't I ever seem to complete projects? Or why do I have such a hard time in, love relationships? Or How come I can never seem to make enough money to, save any? There's a myriad of these types of patterns, and a person can easily fall into shall we say, a painful relationship with themselves because they recognize at some point that they're not able to get past these sort of invisible blockages in their life.
Yeah, and archetypes and a lot of what I take you through in this course allows you to move past some of the guilt, shame, and judgment around that of why can't I make these changes? Why can't I do this? Why can't I show up in this way? And actually brings you more into an orientation of first, let's understand how you're benefiting from that pattern. And once you understand how you're benefiting, you understand what unconscious need is getting met. So then you can say, okay, how can I now get this need met in a conscious way?
Yes. Hi, everybody. I am so excited to tell you about Wild Pasture's amazing meat delivery service. They have beef, chicken, pork, and wild-caught fish. My family and I have been enjoying their meat for quite some time now, and I just couldn't wait to tell you about it any longer. We had an amazing barbecue this weekend, and I'm still high off the meat. And they use a whole network of regenerative farms, which means that you're getting a different ecosystem from each farm, which means a different nutritional profile, which means nutritional diversity, which means health and vitality, which is exactly what we need right now in the world for ourselves and our families so we can all make a difference in the world. And Matt Smith's going to tell us more about this amazing company, Wild Pastures, about their offering and how you can get it. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks so much, Paul. And I'm excited to tell your listeners what they can get today and how we can help them out. So, as you know, pastured meats are crazy expensive. And so our goal with Wild Pastures is to tap into this network of regenerative farmers and to finally create the solution of where we can get the highest quality meats delivered straight to your door for the most affordable prices around. And so we're on average seeing that we are 40% cheaper than any other delivery option out there, and that our customers have reportedly saved, on average, $1,000 on their grocery bill from meat alone. And so Wild Pastures is a regenerative meat delivery service that is solving this problem. And you can get 100% grass-fed and finished, as well as pasture-raised pork and poultry and wild-caught seafood from Alaska delivered straight to your door. So it's far more convenient. It's far more environmentally friendly because we're using regenerative farms entirely. We don't use feedlots ever. So the nutrition profiles are way better. You can definitely taste the difference. I know we were talking about this on our just before we hopped on, you having a Father's Day barbecue and how incredible the pasture-raised chicken and beef short ribs were. And you can really taste the difference, right?
I'm still high.
And so our goal is to remove the roadblock from people's minds that if they want to eat healthy, it's too expensive. And so that's where Wild Pastures comes in, is we are delivering with our own fleets of trucks whenever possible. We haven't raised our meat prices in over 3 years at this point. And we're really just creating convenience for the consumer and kind of being the high tide that rises all ships. If we can opt more people into a system like this, the cost stays down for everybody. And so there is a myriad of benefits that go into that. And so today, if your listeners want to try Wild Pastures and taste the difference and experience what it's like, go to wildpastures.com/Paul Chek or click the link in the show notes and save 20% off for life, plus get free shipping for life, plus get $15 off your first box.
That's a mind-blowing deal. I can't even imagine. I mean, I've never heard of an offer like that. And, most people would hear an offer like that and think, this can't be that good. But I'm telling you, it's not only that good, it's really good. Or I would not be sharing this on my podcast. I think everybody needs to get a hold of Wild Pastures for their family, for their vitality, for their longevity, and for the future of this planet. So thank you guys very much. So Matt, just repeat the website again.
Sure. Just go to wildpastures.com/Paul Chek or visit the link in the show notes and get 20% off for life, plus free shipping for life, plus $15 off your first box so you can try it.
You'll be glad you did. We speak of soul contracts and we speak of, archetypal contracts and things like that. But for many, that's sort of an elusive concept. A lot of people have no conception of the idea that they might have any choice to do anything in the afterlife, because most of these contracts are established when we come into life. It's not like you sit down in a classroom when you're 12 and say, okay, I'm going to take on the victim archetype, and I'm going to meet the following 72 people in my life, and this one's going to piss me off, and this one's going to hold my hand and help me grow. So for a lot of people, these kinds of concepts, they seem very fluffy, new age. They can't wrap their heads around them. And admittedly, these are deep concepts. Without a study of metaphysics and real spiritual development, you can see why people would be confused about having a contract with something that they seem to have no agency over, and they don't even often have agency over it in their lifetime. Yes, we can make friends and things like that, but oftentimes we don't realize the people we're making friends with because it was, shall we say, ordained. It was something we came in with. So the next question is, what are archetypal contracts, and how does that relate to the healing journey? So maybe as you address that, I'd like to hear you see what comes out of you with regard to, how in the world are we getting these soul contracts? I mean, how do you do that?
Yeah. And, we don't even have to make it like new agey or fluffy. We can make it very simple, and we can even replace the word contracts with agreements. That might be like an easier word for people to understand. And I can give some examples of how that practically shows up in someone's everyday life so they can see it, not esoterically, but more practically. So if we take the victim archetype, for example, I remember as a child, my dad was a physician, still is, didn't have like a very deep emotional connection with him. He was a great provider, but I was always looking for some deeper connection. And I remember any time that I was in pain or had some sort of injury, my mom would take me to my dad's office, and I would get the best treatment from my dad, his nurses, his partners. So the child in me said, when I'm in pain, I get more love from dad.
Ah, yeah.
So there's a contract that I made, or an agreement that I made with myself, is I will use pain to get my emotional needs met and to connect with my father. Right? That's an example of a contract or an agreement of how we get certain needs met. Another example for the victim, which we'll get into this archetype in detail a little bit later, is the victim and the rescuer very often come together, right? The victim is looking to be rescued from the rescuer archetype, and the rescuer is looking to save a victim. So for example, if you're in your home and you leave the oven on and now your house is on fire, you need to call the firefighters to come rescue you. So there's a contract there between rescuer and victim. Rescuer is there to save the victim. Victim's looking to be rescued by the rescuer. There's a contract there. Now, a lot of times you could say, sign contracts consciously and unconsciously. My contract as a child of getting my emotional needs met using pain was an unconscious contract. But that firefighter who chose to be a firefighter as his career, that was a conscious contract. That was a conscious choice that he made. Just like I made a conscious choice to be a healer in my profession. The healer is another archetype. So a lot of times the conscious contracts are what our soul might be drawn to as a way of expressing our uniqueness in this lifetime. But a lot of the unconscious contracts are how we use some disempowered pattern or disempowered role to get certain needs met. And those are the things that we're needing to heal on the healing journey. Those are the things that usually cause the blockages, the obstacles, and the patterns of self-sabotage.
Yes. Now, a distinction here is, I agree with everything you've said, but you're describing this in a way that is oriented towards the events that we have when we're in life. And there are these common archetypes, but Jung says you do not choose archetypes, they choose you. And so there's a deeper archetypal relationship going on. The core and the survival archetypes are actually an inherent part of the process of individuation. If you don't heal those archetypes, you do not become an individual whole unto themselves. In other words, you really never reach enough agency and clarity to become a co-creator in the divine plan or the universal plan. You just act out programming unconsciously. So, of course, you're familiar with the term soul contracts. I think what I'm trying to get at, maybe you can share your thoughts on this, is that how do you describe to people the concept of whether it be soul contracts or the contracts that our soul might be making that requires us to have a relationship with key archetypes as we go through our life? Because a lot of these things are, certainly many people are lost in their life. They're, in careers that aren't fulfilling. And as I described in my Evolve Yourself series, I talked about how we often don't realize that we're doing things that seem disconnected, that they don't really give us a sense of fulfillment. I did a lot of jobs when I was young that I couldn't wait to stop doing. So I was always looking for the next best opportunity. And at that time, in my teens and 20s, I didn't really realize until way later when I found my career path and grew enough spiritually to have this level of awareness that I could look back through my life and see, wow, almost every single job that I did, even the ones I didn't like, brought me into contact with key people and gave me key experiences and key knowledge that ultimately were really important to fulfilling my life path that I came here to live out. Call it, the creation of the Chek Institute, for example. And there was various moments where I had sort of this almost like a aha, like, oh my God, look at that. And so I describe it as this golden thread that was holding all the pieces together, but I didn't even know it was there. So when we're talking about these contracts, we're making these things a priori, prior to our manifestation in physical form. So I'm just curious as to your thoughts, because a lot of people would think, well, how in the hell do you do that? I can hardly make these contracts in a body.
Yeah, so I think there's actually very simple ways that you can start to explore this. And 3 things come to mind that I'll share that have been pretty profound and beneficial on my journey. Number 1 is looking back at your childhood, looking back at some of the gifts that you had as a child. And a lot of times you can actually follow this breadcrumb trail that leads you back to some deeper purpose. I'm actually at my parents' house right now. And in my childhood bedroom, when I look at my windows, the window shades, it's all designed with Native American teepees.
That's so funny.
And when I ask my parents, like, why did you design my room in this way? They're like, I don't know, just like it looked cool. But over the last 5 to 10 years, especially since you and I connected, I have found a deep connection to shamanism.
That's why I was laughing.
Yeah. So there's actually these little signs and symptoms all along, if you kind of look close enough, that there's aspects of these contracts that kind of show their face and just give you these little insights throughout your journey. So number 1 is looking at your childhood. It could be your childhood environment. It could be the things you love to do, even the movies you love to watch. A lot of times what you're attracted to in terms of entertainment hold a lot of the archetypes that you have contracts with.
That makes me a warrior.
Yeah. Also, I loved Harry Potter, which for me is a lot of magic and shamanism. I loved Batman, which was a lot of kind of shadow work and going into kind of like the darkness. So, all of these archetypes really were there in childhood. The other piece I would say is look at some of the pains and wounds that you had to work through at a young age. As you guided me through a lot of my healing crisis. So a lot of the pains and wounds that you experience in your earlier years are sort of the initiation that's guiding you into your soul contract. So the gifts, childhood, the wounds, and also looking at the family that you incarnated into. A lot of times there's familial patterns that you came into resolve. Like I incarnated into a family with Holocaust history. So there's a lot of deep archetypal patterns within the Holocaust that are needing to be healed. So you can see some of the contracts and some of the ancestral piece as well.
Yeah, these are all great insights, and I think you did a great job on that. So those are the breadcrumb trail that we can look at in this physical manifestation of ourselves in our life. And a couple things I would add too, just to put a little more clarity to it and then a little more depth to it, is that when you get to a certain age, and I know you're there, you can look back on your life and think of all the people that really pissed you off and really hurt you. And you realize, I couldn't be the person that I am if I hadn't have gone through that experience. And this is, we're going to talk about this when we get to these survival archetypes, because that's where this really becomes alive. But, for example, I remember teachers in school that I hated. Like, I just didn't like them at all. But later in my life, certain situations came where they had said something to me, like my math teacher, Mr. Hirschkorn, who was a real ball buster, told me, Paul, you don't realize it right now because you're too young, but you're going to need these math skills to navigate life. And if you don't apply yourself to the study, there's going to come a time in your life where you're really going to wish you had, because something's going to happen that requires at least basic math skills. And you're going to be stuck if you don't have them, or you're going to end up making bad decisions that bite you. Like if you can't balance a checkbook, that can create a problem. The point I'm driving is that it's also included in this discussion is it takes time to get to the point where you can look back, but you can actually see how the people that hurt us and the people that made our life very stressful and challenging, as much as we resented it and hated it at the time, actually often woke us up to something, or maybe created so much resent that it repelled us from something. And if we hadn't have been repelled, we might have gone on the wrong trail in our life. So it's almost like sometimes the people that we don't like are there to do us the favor of pointing us in another direction by making us not like, like if you're not meant to be a mathematician, you're meant to be an artist. You might have a contract with a math teacher to really make you not like math so you don't fall into the wrong archetypal pathway.
Yeah. That's why, one of the best reframes for rejection is redirection.
Yes, very good. Very true. The only other thing I would add is, and this is much more of a spiritual perspective, if you consider that, well, I'm going to try to make it a little simpler, but if you consider that God, as unconditional love, does not have a mind till relationships evolve in the process. So ultimately, God's dreaming itself into existence. So because God is in its own individuation process, its own self-realization process, because that which is unconditional can't know itself without creating the illusion of conditions in order to make meaning. Therefore, each soul is brought into creation as a dream that is part of a process of God's own self-realization. And I know a lot of people have this false conception that God knows everything and God is perfect, but I could give you a lot of metaphysical chop suey to show that that's actually not true. But the point that I'm making is, Greg Schmaus came into God's dream with a role to fulfill. By definition, soul in Greek is entelechy, which means a guiding intelligence that has purpose. For example, if you plant an acorn, you're not going to get a banana tree, and you're not going to get a chicken out of it. You're going to get an oak tree, because the acorn carries the entelechy of the oak tree, the guiding intelligence. So you could say the acorn has a resonant relationship with the concept or the archetype that contains the idea of the oak tree. So when God dreams itself into existence and creates souls to fulfill this process of experience so that it can experience itself, it says, I dream that I need a healer to work with this part of myself, these people at this time, so that I can have this sense of fulfillment and bring these parts of myself into wholeness. And so Greg Schmaus is born into this archetypal role. And so in this process, the rest of the souls that are dreamed into existence are in a higher vibrational state, or you could say a higher dimension, which Chris Hardy would call the sig dimension, the dimension of meaning, where consciousness is actually cultivating meaning. And Greg says, well, I'm going to need a teacher along the way to teach me about archetypes. And I'm going to need mom and dad to, put me in certain situations so that I actually can get wounded and end up having to go through a healing process. So there, what I'm referring to is that at the level of the psyche, we're actually interacting with other souls, but the soul of us has this sense of destiny. It has this sense of the unfolding. It knows what the butterfly is meant to be when it comes out of its chrysalis. So from a metaphysical perspective, the idea of soul contracts and archetype contracts are actually very much what we need to guide us, because if you think of God as a giant puzzle within which we are all one piece, Greg wouldn't know where he fits in on the puzzle if he didn't have these relationships that ultimately allow Greg's puzzle piece to express his uniqueness. And nor could anybody else express their uniqueness without the other puzzle pieces around us, such as mom, dad, friend, boss, coworker, pastor, preacher, game warden, prison warden, whatever we interact with. So I would just say for the listeners that this is a metaphysical concept, but it's been investigated, and I've investigated it deeply from a spiritual perspective. So I think that ties it together nicely. We've now looked at the metaphysical aspects. You gave a great explanation of how we can pick up the cookie trail, the crumb trail, or the yellow brick road and say, look at that. Here I am in my childhood bedroom, and mom and dad put curtains in my room that carry the same archetypal motifs that have actually ultimately been of great interest and importance to me at this time in my life. And little did mom and dad know that their choice was unconscious, yet somehow driven by their own soul contract with you. And there you see the mystery unveiled. And that's what I think is so fun, because even though life and God is an ultimate mystery, God's sense of humor is that God leaves clues everywhere. And when you start finding them, then you come face to face with the mystery. And if you don't like the word God, you can just say, well, there is quite a mystery going on, because even an atheist has to confront a mystery every day called the mirror.
Yeah.
So, Greg, I think this is very, very interesting and very important. And as we've both found in our own life, some of these things seem kind of way out there. But if everybody just does what we just described, start looking into your childhood, looking into your likes, your dislikes, look into where you're at now, how you got there, who you found so repulsive that they pushed you in a given direction that ultimately brought you to where you're at, then you'll start seeing these patterns. And if you look at your life and you say, well, I don't like where I'm at right now, then the rest of the podcast gets to be very important, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So why don't you share with us what the 4 survival archetypes are and why exploration of these is so essential to our healing journey? I think this is probably one of the most important concepts for people to understand, because there's nobody that can escape these 4 archetypes. I mean, I've never met anybody in my life that managed to escape them.
Well, you can't escape them, because if you're in this physical body, you are trying to survive. And if you're trying to survive, you're going to have to use survival archetypes to do so. So the survival archetypes are kind of like the 4 legs of a table that kind of support you in times of stress, in times of crisis, in times of really any time you move into some sort of stress response, some sort of life or death situation, or perceived life or death situation, which as a child is pretty much any time you feel like you're losing connection. So the 4 survival archetypes
and relationship. I would just throw in, and anytime you go into a relationship, we're all going to have some degree of harmony, and there's going to be some degree of something that challenges us. In our relationship, we had a lot of harmony, but I challenged you in lots of ways. And you challenged me in lots of ways, not negative ways. You challenged me to help you resolve your challenges. And one of the jobs of a therapist and a shaman is to bring the patient into themselves and allow themselves to experience the life of the patient or the client and go through a digestive process. So in my working relationship with you, when you were my client or patient, however you want to term it, I had to take Greg into myself. I had to take his OCD into myself. I had to take all the challenges he was going through with food, with women, with everything that was going on in his life. And so I had to absorb your challenges and work with them inside of myself, because my life isn't your life. Even though I may have had similar experiences, by working with you, I have to create space in myself to allow Greg to live in me. And then I use my skills as a therapist and a life coach to say, okay, if I could give Greg guidance on how to resolve what I feel happening inside of me when I let Greg inside of me, this is what I would share with him. And that process may or may not work. So there's always this exchange, this two-way exchange, right? And that's really the nature of love, is this giving and receiving, and learning and growing and refining. And that process just goes on. I think that's inherent in all relationships. So whenever you're entering into a relationship, not only with persons, but with places and things, then you're going to have an environment where survival archetypes are going to be at play, because you can be addicted to a home that isn't serving you. You can be, for example, maybe you've got a home that's big and beautiful, but you can't afford it, so it's killing you financially. And even though you love your home, it's ruining your ability to have any freedom, because you are working yourself to death to pay for this big home. Maybe all your kids have moved out and you don't really need this big home, but you may have this attachment to it. So you ultimately, as we'll discuss, find yourself prostituting your life to pay for this icon of who you think you are. But being that person isn't really ideal anymore, because your soul is trying to say it's time for you to become more, not stay stuck. So my only point is just that survival archetypes extend themselves to all relationships, and not only with people, but places and things. One of the most amazing Bioptimizers products I've ever used is Biome Breakthrough, which used to be called Leaky Gut Guardian. I can honestly say I use it every single day. I have a morning routine. I put a scoop in with 2 fresh squeezed limes. I put a little bit of other ingredients that I like in there. And I'll tell you what, if any of you have read my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, and you know how to read your poops, well, Biome Breakthrough makes for some really nice poopy policemen. I've got Wade here to tell us what's so unique about it, but I want to tell you right up front, I love this stuff. I don't go anywhere without it, and I keep a lot of it on hand so I don't run out. So Wade, what is it that's making that product so effective?
Well, first and foremost, we have to look at what's happening in the population at large. And Harvard just released an extensive study demonstrating that virtually everyone has some degree of leaky gut. And that means the gut permeability of our intestines is leaking toxins into the system, which are causing immunoresponses. Now, some people that's sneezing or allergies, but then it can move on to more inflammatory conditions. And anybody that's checked out your work understands this. The question is, how do you actually seal the gut so that you can stop this from happening? And we have a partnership with Birch International University in Croatia, where we have a team of PhD scientists working on this. And we've been able to combine a unique product called IGY Max, which is a patented egg-based product that enhances your gut health and reverses the damage that can be done by all these toxins that are leading to leaky gut. But when we combined it with some specific probiotics, they work synergistically together to be able to repair leaky gut in literally hours, as opposed to going through an extensive protocol. Now, we can't stop ourselves from experiencing all the toxins in our world, or food, air, water, you name it. It's coming from everywhere nowadays. So what we have to look at is well, how do we manage the damage, if you will, that we are taking, even if we're following, the highest levels of food hygiene and, conscientiousness. And so what's happened is Biome Breakthrough has been able to be proven in the lab and in folks. Research papers will be coming out very soon to demonstrate this. And that's why we've called it Biome Breakthrough. We're able to actually repair and stop the leaky gut from happening with the combination of IGY Max. It's a unique set of probiotics, and we're happy to deliver it to people. We're very excited. We can try it. It's a money back guarantee. If you don't feel better, if your poops aren't better, if you don't say, wow, my inflammatory conditions in my gut are going down, you get your money back. So it's really easy to get. You go to biomebreakthrough.com/living4D. You'll put in Paul 10. You get a 10% discount on this and any other products that we supply at Bioptimizers.
I can't recommend it enough. I love this stuff. And it actually tastes good too, which is unique. So thank you very much once again for making such an amazing product. I'm really excited to be able to offer it to everybody. Enjoy Biome Breakthrough. I think it's important for the whole family.
The survival archetypes are there to help you survive but not thrive. Right? So a lot of times when we're playing out the survival archetypes, we're doing what we think we have to do to stay alive, either literally or metaphorically. But a lot of times that's usually at the expense of our own health, at the expense of our own freedom, at the expense of our own empowerment. And these archetypal forces are really instilled very early on in our life. Usually by the time we're 7 to 10 years old, we've encountered the victim archetype. We've encountered a situation in which we had to self-sabotage for our own safety. There was a time in which we had to prostitute ourselves for our own security. So these are very deep formative forces that formed at a very early age. A lot of them can be learned patterns too, from parents, teachers, kind of things that you observe. But they're really situations in which, as a child, you felt somewhat threatened. And there was a moment in time where you said, I have to give my power away in order for me to survive this situation. Whether it's you feeling victimized for some reason, you feeling attacked for some reason, and you say, okay, I need to do this to ensure my own survival. But the issue that you run into is that may have served you in that moment, but in that moment you created what we were saying earlier, a contract with that archetype, which is a pattern that you continue to play out over and over again over the course of your journey until it creates enough pain in your life that you have to reassess it. That's where your teaching of the pain teacher comes into play. And a lot of times the pain teacher arrives when you've played out the disempowered or shadow expression of the archetype enough times that your body, your soul, this feedback mechanism is saying to you, all right, Greg, it's time for you to reassess this contract. Do you want to continue to play the victim to get your emotional needs met? Do you want to continue to sabotage yourself out of the fear of getting attacked? Do you want to continue to prostitute yourself just to ensure some guaranteed outcome or someone's approval? And a lot of the pain in our life is when we're being called to renegotiate that contract. So the 4 survival archetypes are the child, the victim, the saboteur, and the prostitute. And we'll get into each one in more depth individually. But the way I like to almost explain it is a lot of these archetypes are almost like your inner child survival team. Each archetype is kind of like playing a certain role to ensure the child archetype's survival, the child archetype's security, safety, and what it feels like it has to do to get some sort of connection, love, or emotional need met. So those are really the ways in which they show up. And the healing process is really just our relationship with upgrading and renegotiating some of the old ways which brought us safety and security, but obviously at the expense of freedom, health, vitality, and empowerment.
Yes. I think you have a slightly different approach than I do in the survival archetypes with a child, because I have the child in the core archetypes, because we are always born with a father and a mother, and we're the child. So when I use the concept of survival archetypes, I orient towards the negative expressions such as eternal child, nature child, wounded child, abandoned child, only because my system already has the child in at the core level. But so I know you understand the derivations of the child. So which would you like to start with and take us through these four? You want to start with the child?
Yeah, we'll start with the child. And before I get into that, it's important to understand that all archetypes have light and shadow. So there's no archetype that's just light and there's no archetype that's just shadow. They all have that balance of light and shadow. So as we go through it, we'll kind of identify both sides of the coin. So the child archetype, the light side of the child is our playfulness, our youthfulness, our beginner's mind. The child has deep curiosity. The child is able to see everything as a new novel experience and is very present. The child also is very creative and holds a lot of the gifts that we're here to bring forth. So the inner child is really an important thing that we all stay connected to, because it's the source of creativity and curiosity and playfulness. But where we get into trouble with the shadow side is where the child archetype has patterns of learned helplessness and powerlessness and outsourcing self-responsibility, outsourcing the power of choice, looking for some mother or father authority figure to take care of us. So the child archetype in the shadow expression is when we're staying a child and we're projecting responsibility, power, and choice outside of us.
Which is coupled with neediness. When you're in a relationship of any type as an adult with someone who's still acting out the child, there's always a level of neediness where they are not self-empowered. They're always wanting someone else to solve their problems or rescue them or feed them or protect them. So if you get stuck in the child archetype when you should be an adult, it becomes very challenging to navigate relationships with adults, because the effect that it has on the adult is they don't have a co-contributor or co-creator, they have a codependent. And this is why, for example, in all rites of passage ceremonies, they had to completely get you out of the child archetype to become capable of protecting the tribe, feeding the tribe, and being an adult, because there's not an infinite supply of resources out there. So you can only feed so many children before you have a deficit in the balance of how much consumption there is by children and how much work has to be done by adults to maintain the balance of life. What's happened in our culture is that as you're very aware, we have so many people that should be adult contributors to society and to culture and to the world that are still living in the child archetype, that they're staying codependent upon others around them. And this leads to, for example, an exorbitant misuse of social services or of welfare. And so it can become so extremely costly for corporations and governments and organizations and companies to pay all these insurances and have so many claims against them that we actually disable ourselves as individuals, and we disable our companies, and we disable sports teams, and we disable relationships, because there's a certain point at which the child archetype has to transition, in my system, into a warrior, into somebody who has a set of values and is clear on what they're willing to live for and willing to die for, or you end up just with a whole bunch of children, which makes you very susceptible to the dangers of parental figures that have their own ideas about what they want to do with you. And oftentimes those can be very conflicting and very painful when you realize that some of these ideas are not often grounded in love or nurture or care or concern, but profitability and manipulation and serving the greed of whoever the father figure or mother figure turns out to be, which, an example is the president or the prime minister of a country or the leader of a religion or of a cult or any number of things. And so, I would just say that as you hear this discussion of the child archetype, it's not just for children that are children, it's adults that are still being children And it's one of the most disabling things we have happening in the world at this very moment.
Yeah. And there's different variations, like you were saying, of the child archetype that some people might connect to and help them understand their own specific patterning. For example, the eternal child. Like you've talked a lot about the eternal child, which the light side of the eternal child is actually kind of staying young in spirit and young in heart and always staying connected to your childlike nature. But there's a difference between being childlike and childish. The eternal
Yes.
child is childish when it expresses in the shadow. There's the magical child that can see the beauty and potential in everything, but also is not rooted in reality. So it has these fantasy ideas and it doesn't really understand the process that one must go through, or something like hard work. It thinks money grows on trees and things like that. So there's all these different variations of the child, the orphan child that feels abandoned but is very independent, or the adult child that loses connection to its childhood and its childlike nature because it had to develop a lot of adult responsibilities as a child. So learning some of these different variations, which I share in the course, will allow you to deeper connect with what your own unique child archetype signature is, which then you can see how it might be playing out in the rest of your life today. Like you said, even if you're an adult.
Yes. So is that what you wanted to share on the child?
Yeah.
Great. So you want to go, which one do you want to go into next? Victim, saboteur, or prostitute?
Let's go to the victim.
Busy archetype.
Yeah, this one's got a lot to it. So the victim archetype, once again, light and shadow. A lot of times people only see the shadow of the victim. But the light side of the victim is acknowledging when you are a victim, when you are being victimized, and learning how to empower yourself to set boundaries. So a lot of healing the inner victim is healing the need for boundaries, setting clear boundaries in relationship, because the truth is most people feel victimized when a boundary is being crossed. For example, someone's a victim of physical abuse when a physical boundary is being crossed. Someone's a victim of emotional abuse when an emotional boundary is being crossed. So there's a difference between being a victim and playing the victim, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being a victim is saying, wow, I'm being abused in this marriage. I need to get out of this marriage. So the victim empowers itself to take action and make a change and seek safety, right? So that's the light side of the victim. To say I'm not a victim when you're being abused would be ridiculous. You want to acknowledge the role and now take action and do something about it. The shadow side is what most people are aware of, which is when we're playing the victim. And playing the victim is paradoxically how we gain a sense of power and control by playing a powerless role, right? The victim represents one's relationship with power. And we play a powerless victim role as paradoxically a power play of feeling more in control. Like, for example, I said as a child, I would play the victim through using pain and illness to get my emotional needs met from my father. So I'm playing a powerless victim role to attract a rescuer, which gives me the love, compassion, empathy, and attention that I'm looking for. So the victim really represents your relationship with your own power and where you use a powerless role as a way of getting certain needs met. And this is a big thing for people on the healing journey, because a lot of people have learned to get emotional needs met through the victim archetype. And one of the ways we do it is by attracting a rescuer, which allows us to feel significant, and a big thing for people to take a look at is what's called the victim triangle. And the victim triangle is something that actually shows up in almost every area of our life, and actually every industry uses the victim triangle as a way of kind of luring us into whatever it is that they're trying to sell. An example of that would be, take kind of like the industrial side of Western medicine, the pharmaceutical side, where there's three archetypes. There's the victim, there's the villain, and there's the rescuer. So you have some pain in your body. Your pain is the villain. you're the victim of it, and this pill is the rescuer. Or there's a virus going around that's the villain, you're the victim, and this jab is the rescuer. Or you're depressed or you're unhappy, so your unhappiness or depression is the villain, you're the victim of it, and this solution that I'm selling you is the rescuer. So you see how literally every industry is set to appeal to your victim archetype, your powerlessness, and now we give you a solution which allows you to feel rescued, which allows you to feel now more whole. It's really important to see these patterns so you can empower yourself with the awareness of when this is showing up in your life. And, healing the victim archetype, like I said, is one of the absolute essentials to the healing process, because the victim is one of the key archetypes that gets a lot of its emotional needs met through pain, illness, or disease. So if you haven't yet healed the victim, it's very hard to get rid of illness because there's too much gain in holding on to it.
One of the things too about the victim archetype is that as long as you're living it out, you are stuck in a codependent relationship, either with the doctor, with the drug, with the rescuer. So it has a stagnating effect on psychological growth and development, personal growth and development, spiritual growth and development, professional growth and development. So that's, whenever we're in codependent relationships, we're not in co-creative relationships. A codependent relationship, to give an analogy that should make it pretty clear, most of us in school did a three-legged race. You remember doing a three-legged race?
Yep.
Well, having a codependent relationship is like being in a three-legged race with somebody that doesn't want to run or keeps trying to go in a different direction. And so you're never going to win the race, and you can't get to where you want to go because there's not a common understanding of a mutual objective and therefore mutual participation. And so what happens is the love becomes sex and violence love. And sex here really relates to polarity. It means there's a lot of polarity. Greg's trying to go in one direction, Paul's trying to go in another. That creates a lot of polarity. And unfortunately, whenever there's a lot of polarity in relationships, there's also a high incidence of injury in relationships. And when there's a high incidence of injury in relationships, then there's also a high incidence of falling into the same victim pattern and just drilling yourself down until you're in a real crisis. And sometimes, unfortunately, that goes on until a person commits suicide because they can't see any way out of it, because everywhere they look, they've got a hall of mirrors inside of their head, and every one of those mirrors has an image of them being in some way trapped.
Yep. So the essence of the victim, if you want to look for where is this showing up in my life, is anytime you feel like life is happening to you, that's an expression of the victim archetype. Anytime you're falling into patterns of self-pity, that's the victim archetype. Anytime you're blaming is always an expression of the victim archetype. And anytime you fall into patterns of shutting down is also an expression of the victim archetype. So, one of my favorite sayings is, victimhood is anything less than 100% self-responsibility, right? So the victim also loves to outsource responsibility, just like the child does. So healing the victim archetype is really about setting boundaries, really having healthy boundaries in relationship. It's about taking 100% ownership, 100% self-responsibility for your experience. And then it's about seeing life as happening for you rather than to you. And once you can see each experience as something that you've brought into your life to serve your healing, growth, and evolution, then you can actually start to heal the inner victim. So I think those are some of the key ingredients for people to see when it comes to that archetype.
Yeah, I wrote a note there just because I think there's something else I'd like to add that's quite important. And that is that the victim archetype is also important from a positive perspective because there are villains out there. There are sorcerers out there. There are people that do not have your best interest at heart. So when you feel yourself being victimized, then you will find that it activates other archetypes in you. And so, for example, if I feel myself being victimized, the first thing that happens, it activates the warrior in me to say, wait a minute, you're trespassing on my boundaries here, or you're not holding to our agreement, which could be like the US Constitution, for example. So when people start trespassing on freedom of speech, then they are victimizing us. And so at that point, we have a choice to empower ourselves. If you fall into the child archetype, then you're going to become defenseless and you're going to need a rescue, which leaves you very susceptible because many villains masquerade as rescuers. So I think what I'm pointing out is that the survival archetypes are not only there to give you the experience of these different experiences, from being a prostitute to being a victim or to having someone sabotage you, they're there to also help us recognize why we don't want to do it to other people. Because once we've experienced it, we realize, wow, it's not fun having someone sabotage you or victimize you. But the point I was driving at previous was each of these archetypes in their negative expression has the potential to and should awaken us to an optimal archetypal response. For example, it may activate the warrior, but it could also activate the communicator. In other words, I don't want to go to war and be violent before I've tried non-violent means, because there's no real positive outcome when people start getting hurt. It doesn't typically lead to peace. So we might say, wait a minute, the warrior in me is standing up, but how can I express my wants, feelings, and needs non-violently and establish the fact that I'm not just going to sit here and play dead? So another key point I'm driving is all these archetypes have interrelationships. There's actually no such thing as a pure archetype. For example, you can never find a mother that doesn't carry the influence of her father inside of her. So there you have what Jung calls archetypal contamination. There is no such thing as a pure archetype. Even our beliefs about God are often very convoluted.
Yeah, we know that. And the introduction to the victim archetype is the first time you felt victimized. The first time you felt victimized was your first introduction to that experience and therefore that archetype. So that's at the moment where a contract was signed as to, when I feel victimized, this is what I have to do. For you, it might be, when I feel victimized, I need to step into the warrior. When someone else feels victimized, they need to step into, like you said, the communicator. Other people, like, for example, I felt victimized as a child, let's say when I didn't perform optimally. So I might develop a pattern of perfectionism to protect my inner victim, right? Yeah. So a lot of these archetypes work in clusters, but they're all there to protect the part of you that felt victimized for the first time. So that's an important thing to explore, because then you can see some of the patterns and how they're continuing to play out today.
That's all very true. And there's another element to that. We'll stick with the victim. A lot of the victimizing can begin all the way in utero, right from inception. For example, the neonate, the soul in the developing fetus, may feel that mom or dad doesn't want it. So it's already feeling abandoned or rejected. And so it may grow up as a child having this sense of sadness or resent towards mom and dad because it doesn't feel loved and supported, but it doesn't know why it's acting these behaviors out, because they're in the unconscious. And so why I bring this up is because this is why looking into our unconscious and using meditation practices, journaling practices, art therapy, shadow work, looking at family history and family dynamics, looking at the traits that, how did our parents get parented, for example. Oftentimes it's easy to really get pissed off at your parents, but when you grow enough awareness and you start looking into how mom and dad got parented, you can see that they're still unconscious, and they're paradoxically acting out toward their own children the very things that were so painful to them, but they don't realize they're doing it. So that's why beginning to be aware of these archetypal dynamics is extremely important, because you really can't achieve an authentic sense of agency and freedom in yourself until you become aware of where you've got all your power being bled out, you know?